There it is. Okay, so welcome. Thank you so much for coming out on literally the most beautiful night of 2022 so far. Like, and respect to you for being indoors in a basement. I really appreciate your coming out for this, but it's so seasonally appropriate. I'm just curious what, I hope I'm not stepping on your toes at all, but does anyone have any experience at all with stormwater reclamation? Or is this like a good, okay, good, me neither. So we're all gonna learn together, yay. So this is Lisa Loosigian. She works for Soak Up the Rain, New Hampshire. I'm sure she'll tell you all about it, but we are so pleased to have Lisa here tonight. And we're just gonna do a nice, quiet, intimate evening amongst ourselves today. So please, I think you'd probably be okay if we go ahead and shout out or raise our hand. Yeah, awesome. So I'm going to, let's see, Lisa, I'm gonna do a couple of things. First, I'm going to start your slideshow off as a slideshow. And then I need to share your screen, or perhaps I'll share the screen first. And, oh, no. Okay, it's thinking. Wow, okay. Okay, I'm gonna let you take it from here.
Okay, great, thank you. So the only thing just as one item to address, if you can't see it very well, we can shut these front lights off. Yeah, that might be good.
I just wanted them to see your face before.
Thank you. So usually I have my information there on the corner, but I don't have it on this one, but I'll have it later. As Faith said, I'm Lisa Loosigian. I work for a program called Soak Up the Rain, New Hampshire, but it's actually a state program. I'm housed in the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. I work with a great group of people that do this sort of thing that I'm going to talk about tonight, but on a much larger scale. They get federal money to treat stormwater that's running off large areas, like large roads, and causing, you've all seen like big eroded areas and that cause water pollution, which I'll talk about. So our whole program is like non-regulatory. We don't go out and tell people what they have to do. It's really wonderful. We have resources to share and such. So it's called the Watershed Assistance Section, as I said, at DES. And I am lucky enough to be the program coordinator for this Soak Up the Rain program, which I will tell you about. So let's see. Okay, so I'm going to start out by talking about a few standard ideas. Yeah, have a little reverb going on here. I'll just try to keep going. So I'll talk real quickly about the natural versus what I call the interrupted water cycle. You're all familiar with this kind of, you learned about it in grade school, where you have evaporation and transpiration from trees and vegetation, condensation forms clouds. It rains, some of it runs off into our streams and rivers and water bodies and such. And some of it goes into the ground. It soaks right in where it falls. And that's what feeds our groundwater, which interfaces with water bodies and such. And we also draw groundwater up for our drinking water wells. And then, the cycle continues, evaporation, plant uptake, and so forth. But what happens when we build our roads and our streets and our homes and our buildings and our shopping centers and such is that we have an interruption of that part over there. So we have much more runoff than we would under natural conditions, of course, because they're hard surfaces, right? So the water hits them, and instead of maybe soaking in, it runs off. And we also get less of that infiltration, and we get more runoff. And that's what we call excess surface runoff, or you'll hear it called stormwater runoff or runoff. There's a lot of different, some people just call it stormwater, but that's what they're talking about, that part that runs off instead of soaking in like it normally would. And in fact, in an undeveloped area, most of the water soaks in. about half, and about 10 or 15% will run off. The rest never even makes it to the ground. It's caught up in the vegetation, and it hits the trees and the leaves, and it kind of interrupts that, and it evaporates right from there. But when we pave and such, as I was mentioning, pave and build, this is right out here in front of the Concord Public Library, you can get a complete reversal, where now half of the water is running off, and very little, maybe 10 or 15% soaks in. And you might, well, let's go on to watershed. So this is another, this basic water cycle 101. We all live in a watershed, whether that's a big watershed, a small watershed, there are watersheds within watersheds. But the idea is that when it rains, that rain hits the ground and it will come to a common water body eventually. The common water body can be that can be a stream, or it can be a pond or a lake. But when it rains, that water hits the ground and it makes its way one way or another toward a common area. So whether you live up in the hills or right on a water body, you're in a watershed. And so this is Concord. And I just wanted to point out some of the water bodies here. I don't know if you folks know exactly what, if you can find yourself roughly where you are in Concord. Maybe you live near the Pennacook rivers or the Pennacook Lake, so your water runs off into there, either over land or down the street into a catch and such. Or maybe you have the Turkey Pond and Little Turkey Pond and the Turkey River down in the southwest corner. Maybe you live near the Contacook River. There's a little turtle pond there up in the northeast, and I found a little pond called Library Pond. So, and of course, you all know about the Merrimack River, which runs right through town, and a lot of those smaller water bodies run toward the Merrimack River. So, does anybody want to say where they think that their water might be running to when it runs off? You know roughly where you might live? Yeah?
I live in Bow.
Okay.
But I work here, and I am by Bow Log, and I live by the bog. But I also know that I can get to the Turkey Pond, not terribly far from where I live. So anyhow, it's kind of interesting to think about this.
Yeah. Do you ladies have an idea where you might be? Oh, okay. Well, that's okay. Well, you could look, this is just the terrain view on Google Maps and hills and so forth. And you can kind of see, like, it really illustrates the watershed idea.
From where we are, it feels like things would go straight down to the river.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, it's probably runoff is gathered in catch basins and with big pipes, and it shoots straight in there, right into the river. So, yeah.
It's not really treated at all before it goes in.
It's not treated at all. No, I won't say that. Some catch basins, if you ever peer into a catch basin, some of them below the pipe where it shoots out toward the river or what have you, there's more room under there. So salt and heavy materials will settle in there, and then it will settle up, and the water goes out, but it will capture some large debris. And in some cities, they used to send both the sanitary water, so when you flush the toilet or run the sink, and the stormwater would go to stormwater treatment plants, which is like, why don't we do that? That sounds like a great idea. Let's clean all that water instead of shooting it straight into our water bodies. But the problem is that when it rains, too much water comes to those treatment plants, and raw sewage is shot out into the river or what have you, because it just takes too much water into the treatment plant. It says, I can't wash all this, get some of it out of here. So it just raw sewage. So there's been an effort over the years to actually separate it, to stop sending, because compared to the water that comes out of our shower and our toilet, storm water is clean. So exactly. So yeah, mostly they call them combined sewer overflows, and there's been a big effort to separate them. So that's a great question. Doesn't like me to use the arrows. So as I mentioned, that term stormwater runoff, water from rain or melting snow that doesn't soak into the ground. And you might say, oh, well, goes to a water body, that's okay. But the problem is that it can pick up pollution on its way. And we'll talk a minute about those pollutants. So examples are sediment, which is just sand, dirt, silt coming off a property when it rains. You can see that's actually a drip edge on the building, and it's loosening up material under it and washing it right across. That's right across the street from the Lusick Lake out in Amherst. And what happens is that's not necessarily, that's not the Lusick Lake, that picture is. One problem is it can make the water very cloudy, and it can clog the gills of fish, for example, or other critters that need to live there. It can bury their habitat. A lot of fish lay eggs right on the bottom. It can cover up their nests. And it carries a nutrient called phosphorus, which I'll talk a little bit more about. The sediment can bring that phosphorus. Oops, we went too far, but that's okay. So, and when we fertilize our lawns, if we use it a little too much, we do it a little too often, or maybe do it right before it rains, what happens is that those same nutrients, the phosphorus and nitrogen that make your lawn green up, if they wash off into a pond, it can make it green up there too much in a lake or a pond. It stimulates the plant growth just like it does in the lawn, and it can cause an overgrowth. It can cause algae to toxic algae even to explode. If you've ever heard of not literally explode, but multiply and be too much. If you've ever heard of a cyanobacteria bloom in a pond or a lake, you can't swim in them because they have neurotoxins. So we're fertilizing our lakes and our ponds when we fertilize our lawns if we do it a little too much or too often. And of course, bacteria also. It would be nice if our pets would pick up after themselves, but they don't. Yes, there are wild animals too that there's bacteria in their waste that can wash down into our water bodies and cause unhealthy conditions. E. coli, you may have heard of that, which can make people sick. So those are some examples of the types of pollutants that can be washed down from our neighborhoods, our streets, and into water bodies. And that occurs whether you live right on the water. A lot of people think, well, I don't live by the water, so maybe it's not such a problem, and maybe it isn't, but maybe it is. But especially when we see these big green lawns and the lack of natural vegetation right by lakes, that can be a little bit of a red flag. There's somebody that had a walkway that went right down to a pond, and it's all eroding and bringing that sediment and maybe some fertilizer from their lawn up above, down into the pond. Maybe you live on a dirt road, some people do, and obviously when it rains, the sediment and such, maybe other pollution coming down into the water body right along the road, getting in there. Most of us just live in a neighborhood or something like that, and we see catch basins everywhere. So those pollutants will come off the street, off our lawns, our houses, our buildings, go into a catch basin, and as we mentioned, then out a pipe into a water body. So we look at ourselves and say, am I part of the problem? So I'll just pause to say there are rules and regulations for large paved areas and large, what we call impervious surfaces. Certain cities and towns cannot let all that stuff just wash off into a water body untreated. It's permitted through the EPA. They have to capture it. They have to put it in. If you've ever been driving down the road, like down the highway, you see those big dugout areas. They call them detention or retention ponds. Those are for the stormwater to go in there, settle down, remove some of the pollutants before it gets to water bodies. So there are rules and regulations for those, some of those big runoff problems, but we can be, us collectively at our homes, also add to that. So we look and see what can we do. Water coming off your roof may have some heavy metals as the asphalt starts to deteriorate, maybe some bacteria from birds if they land on your roof. And also, one I didn't talk about earlier is warm water. If you live near a cold brook and you have a neighborhood full of black roofs and pavement and driveways, when that cold rain hits those surfaces, they heat up, when the sun's out. And so that cold water that would be falling naturally and going into that cold running brook, instead it ends up being warm water. It's warmed when it hits the driveway and the roof. Now warm water will go into that brook, and maybe some type of native brook trout can't live there anymore because the water's too warm for them. So our roofs can cause a number of different things. I showed a picture earlier of a drip edge and how it can loosen up sand and sediment, and that can wash off. We talked about fertilizers, but also pesticides, anything you put on your lawn or do on your lawn. Your driveway, again, warm water, or our tires break down, so hydrocarbons from that are leaking, oil or gas, that can all wash away. Our pets. So these are all things, examples of those pollutants we talked about earlier that we find right at our own homes. So that's why this program was created at DES, for that, to talk to people about that residential part. So we had this guide called the Homeowner's Guide to Stormwater Management. It was just sitting around on the shelf and wasn't getting very far. So we created this program, hired me basically, to help get this program going. I used to be an assistant, and then the manager left, and so up I went to start to manage it. So we created the Soak Up the Rain program, which to market the guide and get it out there. We have a wonderful website. It's not like a hard to navigate DES page. It looks more like a blog. We partner with lake associations around the state. We do a lot of partnerships with them. We go out and I do this talk to them, and then they can actually sign up, and we can go to their houses and say, oh, if you did this here and that there, you can capture that and stop it from moving to the lake. So we try to get the word out through that. Presentations, of course, we do trainings to landscapers and other groups. We do a lot of outreach events, so we try to get the word out in a lot of different ways. And this guide is available. It ended up being very costly to print last time we did it, but I always say, it's, in my mind, paid for with your tax dollars. So if you want a copy, you can have it. But I just don't bring boxfuls of them anymore to hand out, just to be responsible. But you can have a copy, or you can access it on the website, SOAKNH.org, or just type in Soak Up the Rain, New Hampshire. And it's on there in its entirety and in different parts and pieces, which I'll talk about in a minute for you to see. It talks about the why, which we've just been talking about, and the how to soak up the rain is what I'm going to talk about next. How to look at your property, and the 10 stormwater practices that we promote, and lots of different things you can do, but we ended up with these 10 to teach people about. And there's lots of other resources there in the guide online and in person. So I'm going to move now into these 10 practices that we promote. They're called do-it-yourself stormwater solutions, but I'll just pause in case any of you have a question or a comment, or anybody online. Yes? Hi.
So
Yes.
but I was driving in Guilford, neighborhood town, and there is this area where no matter how torrential the rain is or how long it lasts, usually you're okay to drive, you're safe and nothing happens. But a couple of years back, it rained torrentially again, and it clogged up the entire area, the main area where I was. And I was wondering what happened to cut down the in the road, like fresh road. And before, when it did rain, it seemed like an amount of time, but this time it was like flooded, and they closed the roads, and you had to go before. What could cause that?
I don't know specifically. One thing that comes to mind is if it happened to rain more quickly. If that same, maybe it rained the same amount in nature too, but it happened in a much shorter time period, then the water, hard time getting where it needs to go in order to move off. Or they could have reconfigured some roadways, or use some curbing that used to be, that wasn't there before. I don't know, but that's my best guess, is maybe it just rained faster and it just couldn't move away. Is that?
Yeah, I just never, I was also on the inside of those places. That goes from my understanding to the main stream of river or lake or whatever.
Yeah.
Those specifically, I just like I was asking, we use the roads every day, but
Right.
we don't really think about what's going on, all these things.
You're right.
So,
Yeah, we kind of take it for granted and don't think about it too much. But yeah, maybe some of the outlets had gotten clogged up with something, so the water couldn't flow and it backed up onto the street.
yeah, maybe there was maybe sediments were.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes the top of the catch basin itself will get covered with leaves and sticks and debris, and the water can't get in them. So yeah, it was a different season. Yeah. Yeah, maybe.
All that salt and sand. Sometimes they don't sweep them up too quick.
Right. Yeah.
Mixer salt.
Any other? Any other questions or comments? Okay. So I'm going to introduce you to each of the practices that we promote. And I call some of them are truly infiltration practices, which is a way to get that water into the ground. Like we talked about, we have our roof in our driveway, and so it washes off. And what we want to do is get it to soak into the ground, what would have done if our house or our driveway wasn't there. So some of these are true infiltration practices, or I call them holes in the ground filled with stone. So for example, a drip line infiltration trench is just a trench dug under your drip line so that the water can go in there and instead of running off. We have just some pictures of a project that we didn't do, but some partners of ours did it up at Nippo Lake in Barrington. So you can see maybe it was eroding all underneath this drip line. This material was being loosened. The lake was, 10 feet away maybe. It was running down there, not only, and they had a sandy area. So not only the loose material here, but it was causing rivulets in their little beachy area, and that was just going right into the water. So we went out there, made several different recommendations, and one of them that they did was a drip line trench. So, and yes, if anybody says, well, you don't want to put water into your basement, you're right. You don't want to put water into your basement, so you need to be thoughtful and careful. And there's instructions in the how-to sheet to address that kind of thing. You can actually put a pipe in there, put a braided pipe and have it come out somewhere, maybe dig a dry well, which we'll talk about in a minute, and have it go in there instead. So there's lots of creative things to do. A driveway infiltration trench is similar. It's just along a driveway instead of a drip line. In this case, the water, rather than coming off the driveway or onto the road, is coming off the road onto the driveway. This is a house at Phillips Exeter Academy. It's coming onto this driveway, running right down the yard there into the road, into the Swampscott River. So we worked with them to design, and they installed these two infiltration trenches on two sides of the driveway. So the water goes in there and doesn't wash down to the river. There's also a rain garden there behind it, capturing the roof runoff from that White House, which I'll talk about in a minute. A dry well is your classic hole in the ground filled with stone. So I don't have the picture of how the water was coming here. It was coming down the driveway, off the roof, in front of a garage, going into this pipe. There was a little grate here, the pipe, and going straight into a pond. So we worked with the homeowners. This was through a grant that the Great Bay Stewards had with our program. We helped them dig this hole, lined it with fabric, and so the water now goes into that dry well, and when it fills up, it still goes to that pipe, but in smaller storms, it all gets soaked into the ground rather than heading off into that pond. Dry wells also can be used in creative ways. This is up at Green forget what camp this is, up in Green Mountain Conservation Groups area up in Freedom, I think. I forget which camp, but it's not important. There's in the foreground here, there were lodges where the kids stay overnight and such, and it got very compacted. The water was running off of it, running around this little granite bench they had there for the kids to sit and look out at the water, but it was becoming an eroded area on the other side there. So we worked with the kids, and my little graphics, I do it with my hands, and then I always forget the arrows are coming. And we worked with the kids. It was really a great educational opportunity too. We dug a hole right in front of that granite bench, lined it again with fabric to keep the soil from moving into the stone area. And now the water comes down and it's and goes into that dry well instead of running off and eroding the embankment. Infiltration steps are another type of infiltration device. This is the same picture I showed you earlier. It's over in Loudon. They have a pond called Pothole Pond. They have an association around that. And we went out and made some recommendations. So this water was coming, as I mentioned, off the lawn area. This was some sort of steps here. You can see some old logs and whatnot, trying to make it these steps, but it really wasn't functioning anymore. The water was going right into the pond. And so we worked with them to build these what's called infiltration steps. They're just boxed out and backfilled with stone, so the water comes down and hits those. And again, I keep mentioning how they're right near a pond because we end up working with lake associations. But if this was in your side yard and it ended up running down into the road and into that catch basin, like we mentioned, it's still going to go to a river or a pond or a lake or something. So these practices can be used anywhere to prevent runoff coming off your property and making it to a water body. And this was another, we call this an infiltration landing, really. This was coming off of a parking area and going right into Wentworth Lake there. You see the water moving there. And so we worked with them to build just boxed it out and backfilled it with stone so that the water moves into that instead of into the lake. Coarse pavements are more intense practice. They're designed to have water hit them and then go into the ground. They actually they have a sub base underneath them filled with, again, just like clean crushed stone, or so that when the water goes in between the pavers and move into that sub base instead of running down the driveway. So there's lots of different types too. You can see that's type of a concrete paver with the ridge shape, and you can use those for overflow parking areas, temporary, seldom used parking spots. So that's more like grass than pavement. You may have been on porous pavers, but you just don't know it. One thing to look for is blocks of grout between them, so that the water can go between them and get into that subbase you can see under that worker's feet. There's
like regular sidewalk blocks, but they looked like a really stony, but that it's graded pretty rapidly.
Oh. Yeah, so it was this type that handled.
It handled it really well, yeah.
Good, that's good to know. These are used on boat ramps too, people, for their own or by an association to keep it from eroding. That black ridge part up there, you can just fill it with stone or whatever you want. So it's an erosion control device. So thank you for sharing that. I don't know what I'm touching. It's making it. So rain gardens, I like to call a hole in the ground filled with plants. All the others are filled with stone. Rain gardens are really popular right now. They're used both by homeowners on a small scale, but if you ever heard of a bioretention garden or a bioretention, it's the same thing. When they're done in a large scale, often they'll have piping so it overflows and it ends up in a pipe somewhere. But for a homeowner, we don't use any piping. We dig a hole and put plants in it. So that's just a photo of one after it was done, and had filled up with rain the next day, and it's starting to drain. I'll give you a little more on that. So the key feature to a rain garden is really what we call the ponding area. So this is the original grade. You can see the grass on either side of it. You dig a hole, you put your planting medium in the bottom of it like you would for any great garden. If it was a raised bed, you bring in some soil, but you put that at the bottom, but you leave an area down below grade. So it's a sunken garden. And what happens is when it rains, it will fill up. You can see this one in the picture anyway, it's attached to the roof, the gutter and the downspout, and then there's very corrugated piping there that dumps it right into the garden. And then when the sun comes up, it soaks in. And so they're really a little feature for people that like gardens or like to plant. Again, so what we're trying to do is mimic what would happen if your building wasn't there. Water would be soaking in, so those are some ways it could happen. Faith, did you have a question?
Do you certain types of plants that are okay being watered all the time, or can you, is it more like the design of the garden is key and like anything?
No, you do need certain plants, and in fact, we have a rain garden planning page on our website, and we're lucky enough to work with a PhD horticulturist named Kathy Neal before she retired. She always wanted to create a rain garden plant list, and we worked with her, and we got it done before she retired. So we do have, you're right, you need plants that can be submerged for, they're designed, you want them to drain within 24 hours or so you don't have standing water in them. So you need plants that can tolerate that. So yes, thanks for asking about that. Good old-fashioned rain barrel. I call it the gateway into stormwater management because it's easy, and you just put it under your drip line or at the bottom of your gutter. In this case, we worked with a grant partner, and they split their gutter system to go to either side. Use 2 rain barrels, one at each end, because they do fill up really quickly. It's only 50 or 60 gallons, so they fill up quickly. But I use one in my house, especially when it starts to get droughty, and I got to water my plants. I have 60 gallons worth to water my little whiskey barrel or my whatever annuals I have around. We don't officially recommend them for watering vegetable plants because of those pollutants that I talked about earlier that can come off the roof. I've done it occasionally. I water the ground and not the plant, just so I'm not dumping things directly on, dumping that water directly onto a plant I'm going to eat. And some people get really clever and find a way to have the first flush, as we call it, the first water that comes off to go to the side and then fill up a rain barrel. So, there are ways you can use it, but they have their place in stormwater management. So the rest of these, like the rain barrel and such, they're not truly infiltration devices, but they do address other stormwater runoff issues, like a vegetated swale, which is just sort of a ditch, sort of a V-shaped area. You see them all the time by the side of the road, just for conveyance, just to move the water toward the catch basin or whatever. But if you can put some plants in one, it does some good because they slow the water down, they soak some of it up, some of the sediments can get caught in them. In fact, these are pictures in my neighborhood where this guy, I'm not sure why he does it, my town doesn't tell him to stop, but he likes to gouge out the swale on the side of the road, and it just seems it's always pulling material and dumping it into that catch basin. And right up the street, this is happening. I'm like, well, isn't that a lot nicer? Why, So, but, the water hits that, comes in a little more slowly because it needs to get over that grass. It looks nicer, it's more stable. You can imagine there's not sediment coming off of here because it's stabilized with the grass. So that's just a very basic example of the difference in what vegetation in a swale can do. And in fact, we see things like this on the sides of people's driveways, and they ask what can they do. You know, sometimes if they're on a hill, it's really hard to get plants to establish there, but we tell them to build little check dams. So I made this little graphic up. You know, use whatever you have. You can use logs and stones, whatever you have around. So when the water comes out of the pipe, you see the pipe top there, it'll kind of get caught behind that dam. Literally, you're building a little dam. So some of the sediments and other debris can settle out there, and in a bigger storm will overflow that first one and come to the second one. We're trying to slow down the water, let it settle, let it soak in. Sorry, I'm taking too much time because I just like talking about this stuff. So another thing you can do is divert the water with some type of water bar. So this is at another camp up in Freedom. We work with the students. This is a huge gouged out swale going down from the upper area. It was running right into the back of the building there in the background, hitting that building, going around, and heading down toward the lake there. So we worked with the students. I wish I had pictures of them there. Not the students, but the campers, to show them how to build water bars, and they did a lot of this labor. So those are 6x6. They are pressure treated, which some people are like, don't put chemicals in the ground, but you know, we're also preventing a lot of pollution from getting into the water body. So we hope on balance we're doing more good than harm. You don't have to use pressure treated wood. You can use stumps and logs nearby. We could have used those, but in this case, that's what we did. They're fastened in with a rebar that's driven in, and you ditch out a little bit behind them, just as deep as the bar itself, so that when the water hits this, instead of coming running down, it hits it and put it at an angle to the slope so that the water moves along the bar to the vegetated area. And you can see we did a whole series of them there. And then there's another kind of really cool, I love these, they call them rubber razors. So what happened, this is lumber, and this is reclaimed or reused conveyor belt material, which you can get at a stone processing plant, like a gravel yard or something. There's these people up in Nipple Lake, they build these things, put them in all over each other's driveways. So you sandwich that conveyor belt material between the lumber and you bury it so that when the water comes down, again, put it at an angle, the water comes down, you see the lake in the background. That was all running down the driveway, down that little path and right into the lake. So now it comes and it hits that conveyor belt material that sticks up above the ground, the lumber is buried, and the conveyor belt material sticks up, and again, you put some stone behind it, and it encourages the water to go off. You can see there's a vegetated area there. We made a little dugout area for the water to get into and soak in. So not only is it soaking in, it's preventing the pollution, the sediment, and other material from getting to the lake. And then you can drive over them. That's why they build it with that kind of material. So you can drive over it with your car and your truck or your golf cart or what have you. So those are really fun devices. You can build them out of other things too. It's just one type. And if you are lucky enough to live on a water body, what we love to see is a natural vegetated buffer instead of grass going down. There's rules now. The Shoreline Protection Act tells you that you cannot put grass down to the shore anymore. So if you see that, some of those places in Meredith along the lake, they might be doing something they shouldn't be doing. You have to leave a certain amount of vegetation, certain points they call them, trees. You have to leave shrubs because it protects the lake so much from that water coming down and running over the grass, the fertilizer, pesticide, whatever they're using. It protects, it keeps that from getting into the lake, prevents erosion. These are just some nice buffer pictures. This one, they had a natural buffer at one end, and the other there was nothing, so they planted a buffer. It doesn't have to be natural shrubbery; it can be planted. But it's an excellent way, and that's the end of the 10 practices that we promote. Like I said, there's plenty of other things you can do. So I just have a few slides left, but I want to just pause again in case anybody had a question or comment about. All right, we did a few as we went, so that was good. So I always tell people if you can't do any of those things, they don't work for you, or you don't have an opportunity, or whatever. There are lots of things you can do called good housekeeping tips, and there's a whole page of these too listed in the guide and online. Like taking care of your vehicles so they don't leak on your driveway, and that stuff doesn't wash down into your river or lake. Responsible lawn care. Well, most of our soils, even though there's lots of rocks and things in our soils, most of them will keep a lawn looking pretty good. I think some people tend to over fertilize, a little more than it needs. Lawns don't really need, grass doesn't really need as much as we give it. And I'm a big fan of encouraging people to maybe cut down on the lawn a little bit. I know people like to have lawns to play and play with their pets and their dogs and have company and games and whatever. But letting some areas naturalize is an excellent way to, it reduces your own labor for keeping your lawn up, but we're having a problem with pollinators in this part of the country and a lot of parts of the country. We don't have enough plants for natural pollinators to come and do their thing. So not only are you reducing your labor on the weekend, but you're doing, you're providing a functional ecological service to give habitat to bees and birds and butterflies and all those other creatures that pollinate and keep our world going. Go ahead, Faith.
Alternative ground cover to grass, is that step up or
It is, yeah. Yeah, clover is fantastic. It fixes nitrogen, which means that it keeps the nitrogen in the soil from traveling out to our water bodies. I have people say, oh, moss, how am I going to get rid of this moss? I love the moss. My whole website is full of moss, and right now it's a carpet of bluets, and I don't even have to mow it. It's gorgeous, it's low, and I just love it. So any kind of natural, non-invasive, hopefully, ground cover, yes, is preferable over a big, most of the grasses they're not native species. That's why, we have to take care of them so intensely because they can't do it on their own. So I think somebody mentioned salt and sand earlier, which salt is a big, huge problem. Because there's no way to get that out of the water once it gets in there. We're starting to see chloride impaired water bodies in our state and other states. So as a homeowner, I just talked about why sand and sediment is horrible getting into a water body. It's better than salt because lakes can be treated to get phosphorus out. It's expensive, but it can be done. But right now, there's no way, other than building gigantic desalination plants, we're not going to be able to get that salt out of there. And it's very harmful to the critters and the plants that live there. So I always say use a little more sand or a little less salt, unless you live on a salty, by a salt water body or brackish water or something. Maybe the salt is better. But as I mentioned, there's lots of different tips and resources and other programs all listed under those good housekeeping tips. Everything from taking care of your septic system, because that's another way that pollutants get into water bodies, to some other practical things. And so I always ask people, think about it. Is this you? Does your roof, does mine go down my driveway and into a catch basin somewhere, bringing that warm or hydrocarbons, whatever, into that catch basin? Do I have an eroded area in my yard that I could take care of a little bit more nicely somehow? Do you have sediment soil moving into a catch basin, getting into a stream or a river, or no buffer in your area? So we look to ourselves and say, how can I be part of the solution to this water pollution problem? Oh, just a little bit more about the website. Those practices I talked about, there's step-by-step instructions for each one of those online, and you can print them out individually. So if you wanted to build infiltration steps, you just print it out, and there you go. It's just a standalone fact sheet on the website. There's lots of, I don't know what I did. Let's see. Come on. We've taken photos of every practice that we've helped somebody install. So there's photo galleries of a lot of different types of practices going in, or lots of rain gardens on there if you're interested in those. There's stories for some of the projects. As Faith had asked about rain garden planning, there's a whole page for that, including a plant list. And there's property assessment tools too, to look at your property and to identify those problem areas. And then that's it. That's my contact information there, and SOAKNH.org is the website that I keep mentioning. Yes.
Is there a place where it, a commercial supplier of rain barrels that is, I know where I think I put them in mine, you could always get them there. You could buy really.
I wish I did. I went looking for one for my parents a couple of years ago, and I found, I think, 2 at Lowe's. I was like, where are all rain barrels? Isn't this a thing, you know? So they have a few at those larger stores. You can order them online. You can, seen some towns sort of organized, they'll have put the word out, like, we're going to order rain barrels in bulk, so you pre-order and they get them and distribute them. But yeah, the Great Rain Barrel Company, I think it's called, online, you can order one. So, but yeah, they're not as available as I thought they were when I first started doing this. Like, just go buy a rain barrel, like, not that easy. But yeah. Thank you. Well, I appreciate you coming out, and whoever tuned in online, I appreciate you being there too. And I know this was recorded, so if you're like, oh, my friend would probably like to see this, they've told me that they're going to post it up on the library webpage, so it'll be there. And you can always send me an email with questions. You can find me just EPA has a Soak Up the Rain program too, so just put the NH on there, or New Hampshire, so you'll make sure you find our program. You can find me under Contact Us if you have any questions for me. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This was really fascinating. I'm really inspired. Thank you so much.
Thank you too.
And I'm going to close out Zoom now. So this is also a message for myself. I'm going to wave really prominently so that I know that when I'm editing, that's where I cut the footage. So it helps because I can't hear myself.